This is South Asian Herald. Welcome to the DC Dispatch, a podcast where Global South meets the shifting world order. I am Anand Patel. In today's episode, we're going to talk about the Arctic geopolitics. The region may feel distant from South Asia, but what happens there matters to all of us. The Arctic is warming 4 times faster than the global average, driving sea level rise, climate disruptions, and new geopolitical tensions emerging. For South Asia, the stakes are immediate. Rising seas threaten Bangladesh and Maldives, monsoons become less predictable, and global trade routes are shifting. To talk more on this, I'm joined by Dr. Sean Pryor, Shipping Policy Director at Brussels-based Seas at Risk. She's a marine policy specialist with over 3 decades of experience in ocean governance. Dr. Pryor regularly engages with United Nations and regional frameworks, including the International Maritime Organization. Sean, welcome to the DC Dispatch.
Hello.
Well, you've just returned from the Arctic Circle Assembly in Reykjavik, often described as the Davos of the North. Tell us what struck you the most at this year's assembly.
Yes, certainly, and thank you for inviting me to speak today. It was an interesting Arctic Circle Assembly. I don't go every year, but I've been a number of years recently, and I think there's been a definite shift in the subjects that are the top of the agenda there. I think a big shift in the past was from thinking of the Arctic in terms of development and opportunities for new industries and new sectors, to recognizing its importance in terms of global climate change. And I think for the last couple of years, that the climate crisis and the urgency around the climate crisis has really been a major focus. This year, though, I think there was a definite shift again. And geopolitics, as you say, I mean, it's always a part of the discussions there, but the geopolitics around security particularly, I think, had a much higher profile this year than it has. And, it's clear that as the Arctic is opening up and becoming of greater and greater interest, both in terms of a trade route, but also in terms of access to resources there, the geopolitics are going to become more intense, and security issues, not just in response to the opening up of the Arctic, but in response to the global climate, the global geopolitical climate is going to become more intense. The Arctic is going to become more and more of a focus, I think, of security and geopolitical discussions.
Yes, and this year's assembly took place against a very different kind of a backdrop, with no official American or Russian delegations. I mean, Russians have not been going there for quite some time now, but the smaller, lower-ranking Chinese presence as well. That was a surprise. And some observers felt that the room belonged more to Europe, NGOs, and smaller states. What kind of conversations you heard? And what about the angry voices? I'm sure there were quite a few.
It's interesting, actually, because there generally aren't so many angry voices at the Arctic Circle Assembly, but there are always a few. And certainly, I think security is one of those that stimulates heated discussion. But certainly, and I think the global view is changing around climate and the climate emergency as well. So even there are some heated discussions going on. That the climate denier lobby has strengthened, I think, in the last year or two. And so there are some heated discussions around that. But what's really interesting, I think, to me, is how much the frustration that the science isn't really being recognized yet by the policy discussions, not all of them anyway. And there was a lot of information around where we're at, and especially in terms of climate and the climate emergency, what's happening in terms of climate. And yet that doesn't seem to be yet being heard and acted on at the sort of geopolitical level. Security is always an issue, and alongside that, the sort of opening up of the Arctic and Arctic trade routes, because it allows access to different waters, to more waters.
Yes, absolutely. And we'll come back to that, Sean. But you talk about climate emergency. soot from ship exhaust that darkens the snow and ice. It accelerates melting and harms the health of Arctic communities. One theme that continues to loom large is black carbon.
Yes, certainly. I mean, certainly, importantly, black carbon, I think, is increasingly being recognised now as a climate pollutant and one where urgent action is needed. There was more mention of black carbon emissions and the need to address them at this meeting this year than I have ever heard before, and coming from different sectors as well. I mean, the environmental climate sector has always raised the super pollutants as a priority in need of urgent action, and black carbon is one of those super pollutants. But increasingly, I think we're hearing the shipping sector and regulators as well talking about the need to take action in terms of black carbon. I mean, as you know, one of the issues at the moment is that black carbon emissions from shipping are totally unregulated. And so while emissions from other sources, land-based sources, have been striving to reduce their emissions in recent years, the shipping sector hasn't had to do this. And what we've seen in the Arctic is a doubling, more than doubling, in fact, of black carbon emissions in the last decade. So I think that sort of urgent need for action is now being recognised. It was certainly voiced at the Arctic Circle Assembly, and not just by climate and environmental activists, also by the shipping industry recognising, as it's going to need to transition to new and cleaner fuels, that this is a matter that needs to be addressed urgently.
Absolutely. And let me try and dig deeper on this issue because it's very important. I want to understand from you, why has it been so hard to reach a binding commitment at the IMO? Though we've heard about scrubbers being deployed on vessels these days, but what's being done is certainly not enough.
Yeah. The easiest and simplest measure to reduce black carbon emissions from shipping is to change to cleaner fuels, and cleaner fuels that are readily available today. So at the moment, the shipping sector is still using heavy fuel oils, the residual fuels that are left at the end of the distillation process. These are very highly polluting and contain, as a result of burning them, a lot of black carbon is produced. Now, they can only be used in the residual fuel form with a scrubber, but there's increasing evidence now, new work being published that shows that scrubbers don't reduce carbon. They're designed to reduce sulfur emissions, and they don't reduce black carbon. If you're not using a scrubber, then ships have had to move already to what they call blended fuels. So they still contain the heavy residual fuels, but they also contain lighter distillate fuels, which are cleaner. Now, if shipping was to move only to using the lighter, cleaner fuels, things like MGO, marine gas oil, the black carbon emissions are a lot lower. So that is the simplest first step, is to require that they use only cleaner fuels while operating in the Arctic. Then subsequently to that, there is the opportunity to also use various types of technology to reduce emissions even further, and also to look at your engine maintenance and how well the engine and the ship is maintained, because that also can help reduce emissions too.
Yes, totally agree with you on that. And we've seen the indigenous community asking for urgent measures at various forums, including the assembly. But let's zoom out and include the rest of the world, Global South in particular. They're also paying a price because what's happening in Arctic is affecting them. But do we see any urgency among the policymakers when it comes to addressing these concerns?
No, well, and of course, the first impact of the heating Arctic is on the local communities and the indigenous communities in the Arctic, and it's really important that their rights and that their requirements and needs are understood and met as well, and that their voices are heard. But as you say, it's not just the indigenous communities who depend on the Arctic for their livelihood and their culture, but it's also much of the rest of the world. Because I mean, it's a cliche really now, but what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. And the consequence of melting glaciers is that we're seeing sea levels rise, which is posing an increasing threat to many low-lying countries, many climate vulnerable countries. But it's not just sea level rise, as you've already acknowledged. That's the frequency of storms, the intensity of storms that is changing as well. And a lot of this is driven by the changes that we're seeing in the Arctic, the destabilization of the Arctic climate, the access, the retreat of the sea ice, which is allowing greater access to Arctic resources, but is also meaning that we're losing the refrigerator effect that the Arctic has for the planet as a whole. So it's global consequences as a result of what's happening in the Arctic, certainly.
Right. And let's turn our focus back to the most talked about issue in the Arctic, which is the Northern Sea route. I'm told it was a hot topic of discussion at Reykjavik as well, particularly the one along the Russia's coast. We know the route promises shorter journey between Asia and Europe, but it also raises hard questions about fragile ecosystems, about sanctions on Russia. Sean, if you could tell us what risks exist if shipping grows without proper safeguard in place. We had a few incidents as well this year.
Yes, I mean, it is certainly a shorter route and so is associated with lower levels of emissions. However, it should also be remembered that to be able to operate on the Northern Sea route, ships need to meet a different level of standards. There are standards required under the Polar Code, which is a code for shipping developed by the IMO. It's a code for shipping in polar regions. And as a consequence, the requirements for ships are that they have to be ice strengthened. This means that ships are likely to be heavier. They have to operate in different ways. They have to have more infrastructure on board and more not amenities, but a greater abilities in terms of navigation and in terms of life-saving equipment, etc. Because you're talking about such a fragile and also challenging remote part of the region. It's simply not possible to have search and rescue facilities and environmental response facilities in the case of an accident everywhere along the Northern Sea route, nor indeed along the Trans-Arctic route, which is right across the top of the globe, which again was being talked about. So I think it's, as you say, it's not as straightforward as just a shorter route. There are going to be greater challenges, and alongside that, other obstacles and other. It's going to increasingly opening up these areas is going to pose greater threats to the environment as well, both along the Northern Sea route and in the coastal regions, and to the ice and the ice habitat, which is a habitat for wildlife. So. It's not a simple, straightforward solution to reducing emissions from ships to simply choose the shortest possible route.
Absolutely. And I have two more questions on this. From your vantage point, what risks does the Russia-China partnership pose for the Arctic governance? I know it would be unfair to single out China. Of course, India, in fact, is looking at opening a shipping lane with Russia. What would they weigh carefully before committing?
Yeah, well, it's certainly, things are changing in terms of the players, the countries that are relevant in terms of the Arctic. I mean, the Arctic states obviously are, the Arctic is their territory and it's their waters often. There is an area that is still high seas as well, though, that needs to be taken into account. But as you say, there's increasing growth of trade routes and relationships being built between Russia and the Far East. And it's not just China, but China is, yes, probably the leader amongst them. But India, South Korea, Malaysia, Singapore, all of these places, all of these countries are looking to strengthen their trade routes in the Far East. And, as a consequence, they must have a role and take the responsibility in terms of governance. One of the challenges I think we face, particularly when it comes to shipping, is that it's not just about what the Arctic countries want to see happen in the Arctic. Because a ship flagged by, let's say, Panama, as an example, coming from China or from South Korea up through the Bering Sea and the Bering Strait to the Northern Sea route and up into the Arctic, the only country that is going to be able to enforce the standards on board A ship on the Northern Sea route is the flag of the country. In this case, in this example, it would be Panama. Yes, Russia, if it goes into a port in Russia, would also have some responsibilities. But if it simply transits the Arctic and then heads to a port in Europe, then it's very difficult for anybody to enforce any sorts of safety or environmental standards that the ship must be meeting. So increasingly, I think these countries need to take responsibility for governance when it comes to the Arctic, but also be involved in the developments, the discussions and the decision making around the governance of activity in the Arctic. But at the end of the day, the lead has to come from the Arctic countries. They are the countries that know the Arctic. They know how to operate in the Arctic. They know how to operate safely in the Arctic. And they need to be the leading voices. But they can't ignore the voices from elsewhere as they increasingly look to use the Arctic.
Right. So let's turn our focus on the security aspect, one of the dominating issues at the Assembly this year. NATO made some strong statements in Reykjavik, while the Chinese delegates were trying to play it easy. In the Arctic waters, it's definitely getting tense. We saw how last year US Coast Guard flagged several Chinese vessels near the Alaska coast. And it's not just the research vessels, mind you, there were Chinese warships operating near US borders. How do you see this building tension playing out going forward in the region?
It's a very challenging space at the moment, I think, and geopolitical tensions are higher than they've been for a very long time. And I don't really know how it's going to play out in time. I don't specialize in security issues, so it's not my forte. But clearly, the security issues are high profile at the moment. The one thing, well, two things really. One thing that though gives me hope is that actually at the end of the day, although security is an issue and it has to be taken very seriously, is that actually people want to trade and they want the ships to be able to operate. So I'm hopeful that if we can keep the dialogue going and keep trying to find ways to work together, that we can that we can operate in a way that security doesn't overtake the demands or the needs of people. But alongside that, I think, and what's really important, certainly from our point of view, is that we've also got to look strategically at where shipping is operating, because we can't have continued expansion of shipping globally. There has to be a limit somewhere, and currently shipping is not operating within planetary boundaries. And so we need to be a bit more strategic about where ships are going, the impact that they're having, make sure that, especially in the Arctic, they're operating, where they do operate there, they're operating to the highest possible standards that have the minimal of impact on the environment, both from the point of view of the people that live in the Arctic and are dependent on the Arctic, and also from the point of view of the wildlife as well.
Yes, Sean. Let's hope things don't escalate. But now, as we wind up, I want to bring this back to the human level. The Arctic feels far away for many in South Asia. If you could leave policymakers with one urgent takeaway from Reykjavik, what it would be? And for South Asian and diaspora listeners, why should they care about Arctic debates happening thousands of miles away?
Not sure it can be one point, but anyway, I'll do my best. I mean, I think, as I said earlier, and it's a cliche, but what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. It has consequences and an impact on all of us. And so if we're going to continue to use the Arctic, we must do so in a way that is sustainable, that we're not operating beyond planetary boundaries, that we're reducing our impact in terms of the climate, in terms of the ocean, and making sure that the highest possible standards are being operated to and maintained. And that requires not just the Arctic states to be active and implementing the regulations fully, but it requires countries from further afield that want to make use of the Arctic to also play a role in that enforcement of the highest possible standards.
Dr. Pryor, thank you so much for joining us and connecting the dots.
Thank you. Thank you for the opportunity.
And with that, it's a wrap for today's episode on DC Dispatch. Thanks for listening. For more stories and analysis, visit southasianherald.com. See you next time.